So I want to welcome you all to our free workshop today. I'm Michelle Schedule, the Executive Director of Pierce Cedar Creek Institute, and we're all here. It's like when you get on the plane, right? I'll make sure you're in the right place. We're all going to supporting pollinators, one native planting at a time, right? Nobody needs to get off. Okay, good. We're good. All right. So this workshop is being brought to you by Pierce Cedar Creek Institute, but also it's being sponsored by Operation Pollination, which you might have seen some information in our local paper about that. It's an effort that's a community effort, an effort through Rotary to promote pollinator habitat to support the pollinators. But I will introduce Beth and turn it over to Beth. So Beth is a Michigan State University Extension educator since 2001 and consults in natural resource and water quality. She is coordinating the Michigan Master Naturalist Program and educates in the areas of natural resources, water quality, shoreline landscaping, and septic system maintenance for homeowners. She really promotes education that encourages Michigan residents to adopt a conservation landscape approach to land management and yard care practices. Beth received her Bachelor of Science in Natural Resources from Grand Valley State University with a minor in Environmental Studies and her Master of Science in Business Education at Business Administration from Central Michigan University. And she told me she has recently, and she's going to tell you a little bit about this, become a pollinator champion, which you can too. I downloaded the program, but I haven't touched it yet. So maybe someday I will become one too, but Beth will tell us about that. And we want to welcome Beth.
So good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me here today. I am Beth Clausen from Michigan State University Extension. I've been with them for 22 years. And I started out as a Master Gardener Coordinator and Recycling Coordinator for Van Buren County. And on the side, I did natural resources work. And then over time, things evolved, the university changed a little bit, reorganized. And then I just started focusing on natural resources work, water quality stuff, but I still from occasion talk about planting, gardening, which we'll touch on today, not too much. And then I also talk about the Master Composter program, and that one was kind of my baby for a number of years. And so excited about that. I also support the Conservation Stewards program, which Pierce Cedar Creek will be a host site this fall for that. Pierce Cedar Creek is also a host site in partnership, in both cases, in partnership with the Kellogg Biological Station and the Embersall Center with Lansing Schools for Michigan Master Naturalist. I still partner with Ben Botwisky. She's not sure, she's confirmed that. Ellen is in charge of both of those. And so, which is pretty awesome. And in between, we have Michigan State University Extension has a host of other programs that we offer. And so one of those things is a booklet that's on the table over there that it discusses all of the watershed, water quality, and lake type education that we offer. And there's also a really cool file folder for those of you that live out in the country and may have a septic tank or septic system. I also do that education as well. And that helps you, gives you some tips on how to maintain it, as well as a record where you can put on the back of it where your septic tank actually is in your yard. So when you know, if you need to dig that up and find it, you can, and some other great information. But today we're going to focus our talk on pollinator champions, how to plant and maintain that. I'm going to start out a little bit with talking about just kind of an overview of what the pollinators are, who the players are, why they're important, and then move on from there. Okay. But before I start really quickly, is there any burning questions? And for those of you at home on Zoom, if you have any burning questions that you want to get answered today, if you would put them in the chat, or if you want to just kind of shout them out, what is the one thing you want to learn about today that you really, okay. So her question is if you're going to plant for pollinators, can you just naturalize it right in the already existing grass? Is this correct? And do you have to remove your grass? There's two thought processes on that, and that's a good question. I'm going to put a pin in that because we will talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. And so I'm glad you brought that up because that will be discussed today. We hope you have an answer. And if I don't, ask again toward the end. Anybody else have a burning question that they're looking for to answer today, or you're just like, yeah, just give me information and we'll sort it later? Okay, give me information, we'll sort it later. Anybody online ask any burning questions? None. Okay. All right, so pollinators are important. And I put a website up here first because this is where you can go to get a deeper dive, where you're going to get all the information you ever wanted about pollinators. Additionally, there's a card out there for pollinator champions. If you want to take that training, it's free, it's online. It will take you about 4 hours to get through it. So don't do it unless you're going to marathon a Saturday, a Saturday. And at the end, there's an opportunity to get a certificate. And I think there's a charge for the certificate. But this does give you a lot of resources that are free. You don't have to take the Pollinator Champion training. It just gives you a whole bunch of great resources. And so give you a second for that. And then we're going to talk about a little bit about the process, why it's important, what's happening, just kind of covering things that you probably already know, but to make sure that we are all on the same page as we move forward. Okay. So, of course, plants can't move. We all know that our climate is changing. Plants cannot move to adapt to those environmental changes. They can't move to change a genetic material. But what plants have done is that they've evolved, right? And so plants evolved to pollinate in a number of ways. They developed flowers to attract organisms or animals. I'm going to refer to insects, other organisms, and animals as all animals under that umbrella. Okay, so when I say animals, just know that I also include all of the insect world as well. And so it helps them to attract the animals, the other organisms, to pollinate for them. Before, they would pollinate by wind or by water, and some plants still do pollinate. Corn, for example, is a wind-pollinated plant. Pine trees are wind-pollinated plants. They don't produce a flower. Mushrooms are not necessarily a plant, but that organism doesn't either produce a flower. It produces a spore. And just kind of a recap a little bit about how pollinators work. We're using a bee here as an example. The parts of the flower, of course, they pull the pollen off the stamens, and then they travel from plant to plant, and they disperse that genetic material in between plants. And yes, natural hybrids can occur that way, not as fast as when we make our own genetically modified plants with the hybrids, but that still happens. It can happen in nature. And then just to refresh your 5th grade science or high school biology or wherever you learned the parts of a flower at, just to kind of remind us of how the sex organs. Did you know we were going to talk about sex in the garden? Surprise! The sex organs of a plant function in this way. I know when I talk to 5th graders, it's always a blast to point out when they're learning social studies or when they're learning math or when they're learning things they probably didn't know they were going to learn. They get a big laugh out of it. And so the pollination happens, and then seed happens, and sometimes the seed happens on the outside, like in the case of a strawberry, right? All the seeds are on the outside of the fruit, and then some cases, in most cases, the seeds are on the inside of the fruit, and that's how you know the difference between a berry and a fruit. Berry seeds on outside, fruit seeds on inside, and any plant, including those we call vegetables, where they have seeds on the inside, is a fruit. Who knew that? Everybody? Most everybody? Yeah. If you eat a part of a plant, that's a vegetable. If you eat the fruiting body, it's a fruit. So, unless it's a nut or a seed, and I don't know why those are still technically fruits. I know, I didn't make up the rules, somebody else did. But in this case, then, animals will also help spread the plant by eating the fruit and then dispersing that seed somewhere else. So if the tree doesn't disperse the seed or the bush, then the animals also help with that as well. And so plants, of course, have two strategies that they adapted, which I kind of mentioned already. One is without the help of organizations or organisms. They use wind and water. And the other one is with the help of organisms, and that's where animals participate. And they evolved different flowering times, different flowering methods, different ways, different colors to attract different pollinators. Many of our pollinators are specific to a plant, to a particular plant, which is why natives become so important, because many of our pollinators will only feed on one kind of plant. I will use the monarch, for example, because that's the most frequently seen. What plant did they evolve to? The milkweed, that's right, and various species of milkweed, but the milkweed family, right? And so without milkweed, the monarch doesn't thrive. When we talk about animals and animal survival, an animal can survive if it has enough food, water, and shelter, right? But it thrives if it's able to go on and reproduce. And so if there's not enough of these other things and it's unable to produce, it doesn't have enough resources to produce, then it's not thriving. Does that make sense? And so for us, we need to have those pieces in place, as well as the flowers evolved to help the animals thrive, and it became a relationship. Different flowers, different seasons, right? Right now we're looking at what we call spring ephemerals, things that blossom in the spring. And in Michigan, because Michigan was historically so forested, many of our flowers are spring flowers and are done by June. But we have a lot of flowers that continue to bloom or bloom at a different time, bloom later, June, July, August, and then some bloom even later, right? And so they can share the resources that way by blooming at different times. All right, so let's talk about those different times. So February through May, we're looking at the early spring flowers. We're talking about those ephemerals. Skunk cabbage is in full force right now. Do bees visit skunk cabbage? Does anybody know? What's the pollinator for skunk cabbage? Flies. Why? Because skunk cabbage smells like rotting meat. Right. So different animals pollinate different plants based on the time of year. The early spring flowers, those little teeny tiny white things that are growing in your yard that we often like to call a weed, those are often pollinated by not only the tiniest of bees, but by beetles. It is not uncommon to look at a crocus and see beetles in it, because the beetles are out before the bees and they're pollinating early. So we have a lot of different animals that all serve different ones. And these are just some examples here with some dates. March through May, we're looking at trilliums. And can I name all the flowers? No, nor am I going to, but just some examples. Columbine, and then of course the Canadian violet. And violets are all blooming right now. All of these things are blooming. My columbines are up, but they're not blooming, but they're totally up. Where I live down by Kalamazoo. Now, in other parts of Michigan, northern Michigan, as you go north, they get weeks behind. So by the northern Michigan, Traverse City, they're a good 2.5 to 3 weeks behind us in how the flowers are blossoming. Does that make, do you understand? Does everybody understand how that works as we go north? It's colder. All right, it's July through June through August. We're going to start seeing some lilies. And Michigan has a native lily. So, and it looks very much like a tiger lily, it's just a little smaller. And black-eyed Susan here, we see these along the roadsides. These are very common wildflower that we see that's very tenacious and holds on. And if you transplant that into your garden, you might wind up having to dig wheelbarrows of it out just to keep it clear for other plants to grow, because it is pretty aggressive. In a rich garden soil, it's an aggressive grower. And then of course we're looking at, and apparently I have black-eyed Susan in there twice, because that might be elatrius, okay, on the far right. Yeah. They bloom like in July. Or blazing star, or it could be a blazing star. And there are different species of the same animal in the sense of plants. Here we see August through September, and there is a different blazing star species there illustrated, and a prairie sunflower, and then we're looking at cardinal flowers as we move in, and beggar's tick or tick seed as we move to September, late summer flowers. In October, we're looking at an aster, purple aster, and blue Genetian. I can say that really. And goldenrod, and of course we know there's a lot of different kinds of goldenrod. Yes. No, it's beggar's tick is the common name for that. Does not attract ticks. There's another one called tick seed, also has nothing to do with ticks. Nothing to do with the insect ticks. Yeah, good question though. And then witch hazel. Witch hazel usually will bloom in late October, right up through December. But I've also seen it rebloom or wait and bloom in the super early spring, late winter. It just depends on the variety you have and where you live, where it's planted. So to grow good crops, of course, we need to have pollinators. Without pollinators, we won't be able to eat. And has anybody here been in an airplane? Have you looked out the window? Have you seen a map where I noticed it even on the weather map where all of the divisions for the cropland and the nice little squares across the landscape that's across the planet, folks. Except in places like the mountains or the deep desert or preserved areas. That breakup of our land is global. It's not just where we live, it's everywhere. And it's hard to wrap our brain around the fact that we've chopped up our natural landscape to the point to where we don't have enough natural areas left to support the other earthlings that live on this planet. And so we need to start thinking about how are we conserving space to help provide space for them. And in this case, we're specifically focusing on pollinators. And by the way, this is a berry because the seeds are where? On the outside. Yeah. And as you can see in this illustration, a well-pollinated berry to a poorly pollinated berry, because all of those little stamens have to each get their pollen grain. And as I mentioned before, if we don't have enough pollinators, this is exactly what our grocery stores would look like without insects and bees to pollinate our food. We would not have food. And we would definitely have corn, because corn is what pollinated? Wind pollinated, right. So we got to care about our pollinators because they pollinate our food crops, and we have over 90 crops in the US that depend on pollinators. We also care about pollinators because they pollinate plants in our ecosystem. We need to have trees, we need tree seeds, we need shrub tree seeds. Some grasses have flowers, we need those pollinated as well. Not to mention the fact that there's a lot of aquatic plants that send a flower to the top of the water to get pollinated. So there's a lot of plants out there that we have lives, and we think about what we need to do for our own survival and to thrive. We don't stop to think about that we are also a part of this other bit that we also have to support, that it thrives. 80% of all flowering plants need some kind of an animal pollinator. And these pollinators, of course, are important for the ecosystem to function. And it's also important to remember that many of these pollinators are specific. Why do we like the European honeybee? Why do you think we like the European honeybee? It's not specific. It'll pollinate many different flowers. But an oak tree has a specific insects that will pollinate it. Or figs. Who likes a good fig Newton? I know I do. They have a specific wasp that pollinates it. And if the wasp can't get inside the flower, it literally goes in the flower and stays there, and then the fruit seals up around it. And that's how it pollinates that fig. But without that tiny little wasp, we have no figs. There's specific pollinators for bananas, these kinds of things. There's a specific pollinator for squash. I know, right? If we don't have them or have a space for them to thrive, then we're not going to have those fruits and vegetables that we like, that we enjoy. Now, just kind of a recap again, we're looking at our 5th grade science reminder again in our natural science class, that pollinators keep the ecosystem healthy. And in our ecosystem, we have the food web. In this case, it's the pyramid, because we remember that we have the soil decomposers that break things down and make your basic food chain starts. Then the primary producers, which is our plants. Without plants, we have nothing. And what feeds on the plants? Well, the herbivores do. And then, of course, what feeds on the herbivores? The carnivores do. And then, of course, there's the top tertiary consumers. And this is just a very, very simplified illustration, because there are also those of us that eat everything, right? And animals and so forth. And some of us are avowed vegetarians, which is fine. Some of us will eat anything. So I guess it just depends on how you want to live your life. So the pollinators, then, let's meet them. We have honeybees. We have native bees. We have hundreds of native. We have one kind of honeybee or two, right? The rest are all native bees, hundreds. And then all the other pollinators, all the other animals fall into that other category. And I'm a grouper. Some people are groupers and some people are breaker-uppers. I'm a grouper. I like to lump things together. So honeybees, of course, are most familiar. They live in large colonies. They're widespread in the U.S. and they're called the Western or the European honeybee. And just as a fun trivia fact, beekeeping has been a practice for over 9,000 years. We have documentation of actual beekeeping in Mesopotamia, in the Sumerian period. So that's kind of cool. We've been husbandrying bees for a very long time. We also ship them all over the planet, literally ship them all over the planet. And much of our food, of course, is pollinated. Much of our commercial food is pollinated by the honeybee. And beekeepers manage thousands of hives, and they ship them everywhere. And they move them from crop to crop as each crop goes into flower at different times of the year. They'll move them with the crops. They'll go down south in the winter, and then they'll come back north in the summer. They'll go east to west, and then they'll get put on a plane and flown somewhere else. Shipping bees around for this? I don't know. Well, let's go back. If we've been practicing beekeeping for 9,000 years, how long has beekeeping been an industry? How long have we been shipping them commercially? Probably as long as we've had a truck and we could put a bee hive on it and take it to the next field. Yeah. That's a good question. Interesting take on that. I actually had not thought of it from that perspective. And And so growers, of course, will tell beekeepers how many hives they want, what they need, where they need them. Well, let's talk about exactly that question, right? And then they're going to load those hives up, and they're going to place them, place the crops out just before the bloom is full. So bud break, basically, we talk about blooms in terms of bud swell, bud break, bud burst, and then full bloom. And so they're going to probably get them out there right about the time those buds are starting to swell really well and then break. Because then when they break open, most trees only flower for about 1 to 2 weeks top end. And so they need to have those bees out there ready to go as soon as they're ready. And then, of course, as soon as the blooms are done, they move the bees out. Why do they have to move the bees out? There's no food left, right? It's a monocrop. It's a monocrop, and there's no food left for them, and they have to be moved to a location where there's ample food. And then, of course, then they get gathered up again, and then moved off. So, of course, the honeybee is a hard worker, and it does, as I mentioned earlier, it does pollinate much of our food, and it gives us honey, right? I'm very fond of honey. We do have a lot of other pollinators besides that bee. And the reason why we talk about bees first and then go into the others is because there are many people who really don't realize how many native bees we have. 20,000 different species of native bees across the globe. There's only one honeybee, right? And we, our farming practices decided to use the honeybee to pollinate our crops because they were efficient. We could control it. We could move it from place to place. We were in total control of the process. But we put all of our eggs in one basket. And then when we started having trouble with honeybees, with illness, with pests, with pesticides, overuse of pesticides and things, then we realized, wait a minute, we have all these others that are also doing that work. Why aren't we soliciting there? They are not native to the United States. Yeah, that's why they call them the Western honeybee, but they're really the European Western honeybee of Western Europe. We would have honey, we just wouldn't have that bee. Yeah, yeah. So, but yes, there are other bees that do make honey, and there's some native bees that will. And so, so yes, they're not the only pollinators in the game. I just want. Uh-oh. I got a mouse hook up here. There it is. I just want to make sure I'm not missing all my notes. Because I just don't want to miss anything that you might find it interesting. Okay. The difference between having a native bee and using the honeybee is in fact because the native bees are much more difficult to control. Because native bees are solitary, honeybees are conglomerate. They form in colonies, and so they can put them all in one colony, close the lid on the box, and move it. You can't do that with native bees. The only way you're going to have enough native bees to pollinate your garden or your yards is to support the native bee populations in place. Which means we got to stop loss of land. We got to put restoration practices into place. We need to create conservation plans and start enacting those in creating islands and sanctuaries for them. I think it's the flower that drives the flavor of the honey. Other bees produce honey. Yep, but it's the type of flower that produces the flavor of the honey and the color of the honey. So, okay, native bees, of course, come in many sizes and colors. And I'm not gonna list them all there, but some native bees are they do what we call mimicking in the insect world. Which one do you think is the mimic? Which one of the Hollywood squares is the mimic bee? The bottom center? You think that's not really a bee? The green one? Yep, the green one looks a little bit like a wasp. What about the one right in the dead center? Very wasp-like, isn't it? It's a bee. It's a bee. Yeah. So a lot of bees, and there are moths that mimic bees. So they look like a bee. And yeah, so the insect world is very cool. It's just generally the insect world is very cool because a lot of the insects will mimic other insects. It is a type of protection. They evolved to do that. So, and then some look like a fly. Which one looks like a fly? Top middle looks fly-like. He's very green. How about bottom right? Looks very fly-like. And we do have bees that look like flies, and we have flies that look like bees, right? The hoverfly comes to mind. It's a black and yellow striped fly, and he'll hover around your plants, and he's often mistaken for a bee. Well, that's by design, I guess. So, and then there's the bumblebee, Bombus species, all the bumblebees. There's many bumblebees. And the bumblebee are important players because there are some flowers that are very specific. Here's for example, this is a snapdragon. A regular bee can't open the snapdragon to get inside, but the weight of a bumbus can, because it lands on that and opens the flower and it can crawl in. Bumblebees also have very long proboscis type tongues, and so they can get into some of the longer, deeper flowers. And additionally, they also evolved some techniques, and many times a bumblebee will drill a hole in the side of a flower to get at the nectar, and then another bee will come in and also access that flower through the hole that the bumblebee provided for it. So there's a lot of cool things. Blueberries are also very specific to bumblebees. Honeybees don't pollinate blueberries. Bumblebees pollinate blueberries. Because why? Because blueberries are a bell-like long flower, and a bee's proboscis, or their tongue, is not long enough to reach in there, but a bumblebee is. And so they're not pollinating with their body in this case, they're pollinating with their tongue. And so here's a very specific bee. This is a squash bee. This is the only other animal that will pollinate squashes. Yes, you may see a honeybee on your squashes, but you'll also see a squash bee, and it does most of the work, the bulk of the work for squashes in your garden. And then here's another large bumblebee, just because I love bumblebees. I had to put them in there. Some plants, just to remind you, some plants relationships are very general with bees and other pollinators, and some plants are very specific for what pollinator can help them or has a relationship with them. This is a mason bee. They're a solitary bee, and they will live in holes. I advocate keeping snag trees on your property if you have enough. And a snag tree is a dead tree where most of the tree is gone, but a good chunk of it's still there. And it'll generally be filled with holes. When a tree dies and becomes a snag tree, the first population to move into it, besides funguses, is insects and many bees, and usually a carpenter bee. And then up the food chain, after the carpenter bees have created their home there, then the woodpeckers will come along and they'll peck holes in it. And what are they pecking for? The bee larvae. And so then they're generating bigger holes for other animals and insects to live there. So it builds the whole food web in the condominium that we call a snag tree or a dead tree. So if you have a piece of property and you have a few dead trees in there, if you can tolerate looking at that dead tree, leave it there, because it is so important for homes for bees. We don't have to build homes for bees then. We have one near our house. They're fine too. They'll use them. Bumblebees will hide under them. Yeah, so will salamanders and a few other things. And then, of course, ground bees will nest in the ground. So yes, the fallen log might be that roof over their ground bee nest, right? What others not be that nests in ground that we think of as a pest? What? Wasps. Yep. So you're looking at yellow jackets, and those kinds of families will nest in the ground as well. They're a colony. A yellow jacket and that family of wasps are colony, and they protect their colony, and they can be aggressive if disturbed. Ground bees, not so much. So if you see a thing crawling out of the hole and it's not bothering you or trying to chase you away, then it may probably a ground bee. If it looks like a bee but then comes after you, it's likely a yellow jacket. Well, we put a sign up in a public garden one time that said, Yellow jacks are nesting here. Leave them alone. I would not. I would not. Well, so let me tell you a little story that happened, and this is a true story. In our public garden in front of our building, in the mulch, yellow jackets decided to nest there under the mulch. It made a beautiful home for them right next to the compost bin, which was even more fun because our volunteers were trying to put yard waste into the compost bin. We had to put a sign, avoid the bees. And I said, I promised my volunteers, I said, I will get them out of there, I promise, but I have to do it at night when the bees go to sleep, right? And they're not as active. Well, I work from 8 to 5. So guess what happened for the summer? Beth never got around to coming back at night to get those bees out. But the sign was there and everybody was respectful of their own space and they thrived. But what I noticed, we had an oak tree in the front that had the ring-necked caterpillar on it that was defoliating the entire tree. And the yellow jackets were plucking all of the caterpillars from this oak tree and feeding their ground nest with it. And so the tree before was defoliated. That year, beautiful. It looked gorgeous. Why? Because the yellow jackets were taking all the caterpillars and parasitizing them. Okay, great. Beth forgot to make time to get rid of this nest. First frost came around. I looked and the whole nest was dug up and flipped over. A skunk had come and visited our garden and feasted on all of the bees and bee larvae in the nest. We had no nest there anymore. So Mother Nature can sometimes be late to the party, but if we're patient, she will send her checks and balances to create that situation where you don't really have to do anything. And if you have enough diversity in your garden, enough diversity of plants and animals living in your property, that's going to balance itself. And you're not really going to have to worry about a big pest problem with that. That's one of my favorite stories, and it is a true story. It actually happened for me. I'm kind of glad that I didn't do anything because then Mother Nature got to show me her glory. So bees, according to the Xerces Society, which is the society that manages bees, more than 1/4 of America's 46 bumblebee species, they're all ground nesters, face some degree of extinction risk. Because why? Because we're disturbing the ground. We're cutting and chopping and planting and plowing and all those things. Okay, in 2021, it was determined by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that the American bumblebee could qualify for protection under the Endangered Species Act because its population had dropped by 90%. So with that information, maybe we just need, that's where we need to start, right? It dropped by 90%. That's devastating. That puts it on the almost extinct list now. All right, so now we move on to what are our other pollinators, right? We mentioned before, wasps can be pollinators, flies, butterflies, moths, bats, birds, primates, rodents, lizards, and even human beings. We can all help pollinate. And this is a grocery list of them. I don't think it's all inclusive, but it covers a lot, right? So that's what to keep in mind with all of those things. Also pollinate. If they feed on a flower, they're going to help pollinate that flower. And some are specific to the plant that they feed on. And so what is happening to our populations, right? We're seeing a huge decline, not only in just our native bees, but our honeybees as well, right? They're not going extinct, but they face many challenges. And of course, some were mentioned before that they're facing the loss of habitat, insecticide, predation, diseases, and parasitic attacks. And I think the biggest thing that you want to see on this particular map, I don't know, can you see my pointer on there? Maybe if I click on it. Nope. All right. It was worth a try. If you'll notice on the map, see where our biggest bee populations are lacking? There. Our biggest populations there. See the red in red. What do those also coincide with? Climates everywhere, that changes. What else is, what's going on the ground in many of those areas? What are they? Intense what? Intense agriculture. That's correct. So what is happening is we've noticed a correlation between huge losses of pollinators, honeybees and native bees, and agriculture. What do you think the biggest culprit is? Humans, pesticide, right. We use, and for humans, we often say pesticide, if a little is good, more is better, right? And if it says use 2 teaspoons of this product to a gallon of water, you think, oh, can't possibly. I got to put 3 or 4, a whole tablespoon in. No, follow the package directions. It can take up to 30 minutes for a bug to die. If you spray a bug with a pesticide spray killer, it can take 30 minutes for it to die because it has to get through its shell and into the body of that insect. Okay? And so be patient. How many, you know anybody who sprayed a bug? Sprayed it again, finally got tired of it, took their shoe off and smacked it? Should have just gone for the fly swatter to start with and saved that pesticide spray. But we also have other things, right? We have the pests, the pathogens, of poor nutrition, and we're going to kind of briefly go through those. So starting up then, poor nutrition. And let's take a look at our options. The entire diet from a bee, from all the native bees as well, is flowers. If there are no flowers, there are no food for bees and other pollinators. How many people don't want their flowers to be eaten by bugs? I can't. If you're planting for pollinators, I'm just going to tell you this right now. You're not planting for the bee. You're not planting for the butterfly. You're planting for the larva. So native plants are going to be eaten by the larva. And so you're going to see a lot of bug holes in them. Bees need the flowers. Caterpillars need the leaves. They will eat it. So just plant, if you don't want them to eat it, then plant a sacrificial one and move them over to one that they can eat. I do that with my tomatoes because I happen to like the hawk moth. It's beautiful. Nobody likes to have their tomato plant eaten by a tomato worm. So I grow an extra tomato plant or 3, and I put all the tomato worms onto the extra plant. And they can eat that to their heart's content. It's also called, we also plant beggars' gardens and thieves' gardens and public gardens for the same reason. People steal food. So if you work in a public garden, plant an extra plot just for people to steal the food. So then you're not mad. Not mad. So poor nutrition, where's the flowers? Somewhere along the line, somebody decided we all had to have beautiful lawns and then started writing it into lawns, ordinances, and neighborhood association rules. Corn is awesome. We eat a lot of corn. We use it for a lot of reasons. And I'm not saying it's bad. It's a monocrop. They're both monocrops. Neither one of them feed the bees of any kind. And a lot of these corn crops can't feed any insects because they're modified to keep insects away. All right, remember what I said about the world looking like this? The world looks like this. Not everywhere is there housing developments. In a lot of places, there's just, it's all just broken up. But it's a landscape. We're constantly removing the food that feeds the pollinators. Trees are our biggest food source. People want to build a new home. They want to be surrounded by trees. That's awesome. Build your new home surrounded by trees. But what's the first thing they go and do? Chop down all the trees. I live in a neighborhood called Windy Pines. Want to know how many pine trees are actually left there? They named it after what they removed. There's probably about 20 pine trees left in the neighborhood. I'm quickly planting with as many oaks as I possibly can. I've got whole bunches of trees. I also live at the end of the cul-de-sac. Can. And so let's talk about pesticides then, right? Pesticides. We talked about poor nutrition. Now let's talk about pesticides. When I talk about pesticides, I really mean isides. That's any word that ends in the word iside. Okay. And that could be a fungicide, miticide, herbicide. It also includes antibiotics. And there's aviaricides, right? There's rodenticides. If it ends in iside, it's intended to kill something. End of story. That's what it's for. Or repel something, which can be just as bad because they're still not coming in to get what they need. They're not able to come in. But along with those asides come heavy metals, growth regulators. Diesel exhaust is in this because petroleum products apparently impact our pollinators as well. They're affected by it. They're sensitive to it. So yeah. So basically, human activity, everything we do is impacting them. So pesticides, of course, just because you waited until after dark and applied a pesticide because you think you're not killing the bees, doesn't mean that that pesticide is not systemic, being absorbed into the plant, or it is a water repellent and stays on the plant for a very long time, becomes sticky and stays for many days. So a lot of times it'll say safe if you do it after dark. No, not really. How many do you know has anybody here seen anybody use a fogger for mosquitoes? Do we know what they kill? They kill everything. Yep. And some people don't care. I get that. Some people live so close to a wet part of the world that they got to protect themselves from malaria. I get that. But there are also better chemicals out there besides foggers that are more specific that would be more useful. I would suggest a bat house because bats can hear and mosquitoes make noise. So guess what they eat a lot of? Mosquitoes, right? You can also use BT or Barythurgisis or whatever. I don't know. It's a BT. It is specific. You can put it in the water for mosquitoes. So, and you can buy those pellets for your water things and your bird feeders and things. They can be if the spray when they spray no, but because it impacts the larva. And so that's a good question. The BT only impacts the larva, and so mosquito larvae will die. It is a little bit more broad spectrum. They also use it for the spongy moth control, but they spray for spongy moth during a very narrow window when they're hatching out and not when other butterflies are hatching out or migrating in. So that's why they only got like a 2-week window to spray for spongy moth. And so different pesticides have different effects on the pollinators. Pesticides also linger in water. So when they go to get a drink, they're drinking pesticide. It floats through the air when they spray. We can't control the wind. We're spraying and the wind's blowing it off to drift. We call that drift. It's blowing off to somewhere else we really didn't intend it to be. The best thing to do is use your eyes and your observation skills and pay attention and only treat specific plants that need to be treated. Don't broad spectrum the whole garden. Just if you've got a big pest problem on a particular plant, just treat that plant. Be very narrow with your scope and your spray, and don't treat the other plants. Don't think if it's good for one plant, it's good for the whole garden. Not necessarily true. Just treat the one that's a problem. You may have to go back out to your garden with more intensive maintenance practices, but that's better than killing off everything all at once. And so pesticides come in can have different effects that can be lethal, kills them right away upon contact. It can be sublethal, which will impair their behavior or ability to reproduce. And they can be neutral, having little or no effect on a bee. And that would be like a repellent, would be a neutral. And then some other major factors here, this is a mite. And so pests and pathogens, covered poor nutrition pesticides, pests and pathogens do we transfer the honeybee around the globe in trucks and planes? So if there's pests, pathogens, and other things, would they be carrying it with them to transport that as well? Which is exactly how we got that mite for our bees. It was brought in. It's not native to the United States. Our bees may not have a natural defense to fight these new diseases and new pests that are being brought in. And then this is the varroa mite, and here is a close-up of this parasite. It was introduced to the honeybee hives from the Asian honeybee, and it has devastated hives across the United States and Western Europe, and it's now across the entire globe. And sometimes they actually tried to use non-lethal doses of pesticides to control this mite, and that didn't work either. It seemed like a good idea with the best intentions, but it just didn't work. So some interacting factors, then poor nutrition makes it difficult for bees to detoxify. They also aren't thriving with poor nutrition. They're surviving, but they're not thriving, right? And if we recall, thriving is the ability to reproduce, not just being alive. Sublethal effects can make it more difficult for them to forage for food as they stumble around and are unable to fly. And then they also then at that point become a target for predators, and birds and things that might feed on them. And then, of course, other factors that impact the stress experience, multiple stress factors, they combine, right? So it's never one thing, right? It's never one thing. It's all of those things combined that put the stress on the entire ecosystem that's necessary for those animals to survive. And you know what? We could just replace the honeybee with a human being. I could take this whole slide deck and put a human in there, and it would be the same thing, the same end result. So, okay, we covered all the basics. We reviewed things we already knew. We covered the science behind the plants and pollination and bees and what problems we're having with our native pollinators. And now we're going to talk about why we're really here, right? And that's planning for pollinators. And it's our turn. How are we going to support this? Because we're not going to, learning how to put a plant in the ground, I don't think is as important as understanding why we need to put that plant in the ground, right? And being the ultimate why child, I have to always answer that question. So how can we help pollinators, right? So, well, we need to plant more flowers. We need to reduce exposure to pesticides and outside influences for our pollinators. We need to create shelter in homes. Remember I said to survive, they need food, water, and some kind of a shelter or a home, right? But to thrive, they need to be able to reproduce. They got to have the resources to feed their babies. Mice, for example, can regulate their own population based on the food source available to them. And so, and yes, they will. Rabbits too. They'll actually reabsorb their own babies back into their body. It's kind of cool. And not have babies, because why? Because there's not enough resources to feed the babies. So why put out the energy to make a baby just so it will die? So that's nature in action. Yeah. And then of course, so some other things we can do is we can create those homes. We can create watering stations on hot days, and then we can share what we learned with others. We can promote pollinator information with our friends, our neighbors, our family, and direct them to places where they can get more information. And that's exactly what I tell my master naturalists to do as well, to share what they learn with others. That's sort of a requirement for that. So by reducing, of course, the pesticide exposure, spot spray, scout for pests, make sure they're present. Don't just spray the chemical on the lawn because the lawn company says now it's time to spray. Just spray when you know there's a problem pest present. and then only target those areas that have the pest. You don't necessarily need to treat the whole lawn if grubs are only in a small corner of it. Just treat that small corner. Okay, take preventive measures, of course. Before relying on chemicals, can you remove them manually? Can you start with disease-resistant hybrids or something like that? Or can you encourage a really diverse habitat so that you're attracting the predator insects and animals as well, so that the predator insects and animals can do their job to keep the other ones in check, right? Remember the story about the yellow jackets taking the caterpillars from the oak tree. They are a useful, helpful insect. They're not really a pest unless we disturb their nest and they chase after us. But they're actually a beneficial. And when we kill them, we're killing a beneficial insect. So if you must use chemicals, again, focus on ways to reduce exposure to them. Spray at night, of course, but don't spray the flowers, right? Avoid using chemicals when flowers are blooming. Use a minimum recommended dose. Be very specific to control a target pest and these things. Also, you can read the label. Many labels now put a little bee on there if it's bee friendly or supposedly bee friendly or not lethal. How about that? Okay, it's a bee advisory label. Some of them will say bee, maybe it'll have a bee with a line through it and it'll say, no, this is bad for bees or by, so pay attention to your labels. Read the labels, get the right product, follow the label directions. Is it bee safe? And then, of course, plant more flowers. Plant your little hearts. I don't know about you, but my garden always has room for another flower, even though it was never in the original plan for it. just slide that over, put another one in. It'll be fine. They'll figure it out. We always have plenty of space for one more flower, right? You can plant a different gardens. You don't have to have a prairie. You can have a pollinator garden. You can plant large scale, small scale. You can put them in pots. Downtown Kalamazoo and Bronson Park, there were more bees in those flower plantings than there were in the on-ground plantings right beside us. So why did they like to be up a little bit higher than right on the ground? Not sure, but that's what they like. Same flower. So they prefer to be up off the ground a little bit, not down in. So if you have a taller flower, or many of our native plants are taller flowers, right? So think about that. You can do native. Native doesn't have to be a scruffy looking prairie. You can make a very formal garden using native plants as specimen species. It works out just fine. Here's an example of a large scale plot. Of course, this is ideal if we've got room for it. Not all of us do. Some of us live in an apartment. And so all I got is a little balcony I can put pots on. But transform it into something that's flowery. I'm just going to point out here, they recommend a prairie. Michigan is a temperate rainforest. Very little of Michigan was actually a prairie. There were a lot of savannas, which had oak trees in it, but not actual prairies. Michigan wants to grow trees. It doesn't want to grow grass, although it will very nicely. So if you think about restoring something, go and do some research, dig up what was traditionally there before it was a farm, and replant that tree combination to restore that to its natural state. Okay, I'm sorry. That was my soapbox for the Master Naturalist program. I do harp on that a little bit. And then, of course, you can work with experts. You would want to start with a conservation plan. Always start with a plan. Plan your work, then work your plan, right? And then you'll know you're on the right track for doing things in a timely way. You'll also stay within your budget at the same time, because I don't know about you, but it's real easy for me to blow my flower garden budget by buying a whole bunch of something I like and not what was in the plan. So that helps us stay on track with that as well. And then you can also work with local experts, get seed advice and maintenance advice and things like that. There are some government grants available to help you fund it, but only if you have larger tracts of land, not small plots. You can do strips, conservation strips. Planting natives, and I'm going to talk a lot about natives because native bees have evolved to eat what? The native plants, right? So putting a non-native plant in, honeybees will feed on it. Some species will feed on them, but not all species will be satisfied. By planting natives, you're going to attract a diversity of both the pollinators and the predators that can help keep those insect populations in control, both good and bad. You need a balance there. It'll self-regulate if you get enough diversity in there. But if you attract them to a strip next to a field, then those pollinators will not only pollinate that strip, but they will go on to pollinate what's growing in your crops as well, if your crops need pollinators. And just go back and see this strip. Where's this picture on the right? What strip is that? Where is it? It's next to the grass, between the grass and the driveway or sidewalk. Right. Doesn't have to be big. Does not. They'll find it. You can just plant a specific garden for it wherever you can. It doesn't have to be big. It can be small. Plant with diversity, plant with different bloom times. Feed the bees throughout the year, right? So May is no more May, right? So leave the flowers that are coming up, surprisingly, they love dandelions, right? Many of them. You can eat dandelions. It makes a good wine, I hear. And then, of course, avoid some hybrids where possible. Not all hybrids are bad, but they're not going to feed caterpillars and things like that will support the other bigger parts of the food web. So think about in terms of when I'm planting a pollinator garden, I'm not just planting to support the bees or other pollinators. I'm planting to support the entire food web that's going to support that balanced ecosystem. Okay. And then here's another one. This is next to somebody's patio, very small. Everything's growing. We got hanging pots. We got climby things. You know, size doesn't matter in some cases. A pot, a patch, or strip, they're all helpful. Here's another one. This one is part of what they call a rain garden. You guys have heard of rain gardens before. That right there is a storm drain next to a parking lot, and it's planted with natives. And so, yeah, you can plant. Here's one in front of a building. This is in front of a commercial building, right there. And so, if it's wide enough for roots to grow and set down, and they can thrive there, then definitely do it. You're going to attract them. Yeah, it looks like a sedum. Yeah, I don't know all of these plants in these. These are just sort of landscaping options but what am I illustrating here? I'm illustrating that you're not limited to only your imagination for where you can put some of these plants that will attract pollinators. You can alter your lawn if your lawn will let you. I live in a place that's high and dry with a low pH. And the turkeys think it's where they need to keep digging their dust bath every year because it's kind of sandy too. And I can't even tell you how many times I have tried to remediate the lawn and putting down lime and more seed and fertilizer and top dressing with compost. As soon as I put compost on there, all the worms come up and eat all the organic material. And I'm literally within weeks, I'm back to sand again, zero organic material, because the worms don't have enough. I put down 5 pounds of clover seed, and I only got like a patch here and a patch over there. So, you know, even the best of us struggle with certain conditions. But you know what does grow really good in my yard? Trees. I plant a shrub or I plant a tree, and those babies take right off. So why? Because it was probably once very wooded. It's high and dry and wants to be a woods. It's what it wants. So I'm just saying, I struggle with the same struggles everybody else does, even with all my education. But you can replace your lawn. I didn't replace my lawn. I just top seeded and raked it in and added more flowers. And that worked for us. You can span flower beds or whatever you want, reduce the area you want to mow, change the grass out to a no-mow grass or something like that. Gives them more places to hide. And then, of course, when you go to choose plants, know your land. Get the right plant for the right place. Is it sunny where you want to plant? Is it shady where you want to plant? Is it wet where you want to plant? Is it dry where you want to plant? Is it wet and shady? Is it wet and sunny? Is it dry and shady? Is it dry and sunny? Does it have a vernal pool and it's wet now, but it won't be wet in July? Get the kind of plants that will live in those conditions. The right plant in the right place. That's where your success starts. First, know where that's going to be planted and what the conditions are, the growing conditions are. Right plant, right place, right? That's a mantra with master gardeners. And then you're going to want to do things to get started. And it's the same thing you would do for any garden, any vegetable garden. You're going to prep the soil. You're going to remove invasive and non-native things that don't belong. You're going to plant seeds, plugs, or pots. You're going to water it until the roots are established. You're going to mulch it. You can mulch it if you want to. Mulch is always good. Monitor for weeds and things that don't do well, or trees that you won't want to grow because trees will sprout. And then how do you prep the soil? So you can dig it up, you can remove the sod, or the fun thing I like to do, one of my practices is I like to save pizza boxes. And I just lay them all down and stab holes in them so the water will drain. And then I'll put some compost and topsoil on that. I'll plant right on top of the pizza box or whatever box you want. Pizza boxes tend to decompose better because they're a little thinner. And then, yeah, I'm off. I don't kill the grass. It dies. Once you put the boxes down, 2 weeks without shade, most grass dies. So usually it's a way easier way than cutting turf and digging through it. Unless you have some really tough stuff. If you got some really deep, already got wild type grasses growing and you got some tough stuff in the field, you might need to go in with a chemical and remove that first. Wait until, give it the amount of time it recommends on the package, then go in and rototill and plant your seeds. So there's some options for you. You can plant seeds, you can plant plugs, or you can plant from a pot. Any method will work. Just know seeds take longer and sometimes they get eaten. So I've planted plenty of seeds and turkeys like grass seeds. And the turkeys, I have a flock of 30 that live near my house, and they won't go, they come into the yard in single file out of the woods, and then they fan out into a straight line, and they will march across the lawn. And if it's edible, they'll eat it. So I give up. The turkeys the yard belongs to turkeys now. Moss wants to grow there. I told my husband, I said, maybe we should just give up and grow moss. It seems to be the only thing that wants to grow. You need to water it, of course. Mulch is desired. Don't add fertilizer. Wild native plants, do they get fertilizer in nature? No. Many native plants prefer poor soils. If you put native plants in and fertilize them, they're not going to do well. They'll green up and then their roots will rot and die. And trees, they also don't recommend, if you plant shrubs and trees, don't fertilize them for a couple of years, because a lot of people, the practice is to put fertilizer in the hole and then put the tree right down there. Well, it's got all of its nutrients right there in its whole pot. Where are the roots going to go? No place. They're going to stay right there until all the nutrients are gone. And sometimes at that point, they've literally become pot bound in that circle. So you want to encourage those roots to grow out and seek nutrients and water. So water where they need it, don't fertilize. At least trees, not for a couple of years. And then after the roots are established, then go ahead and start fertilizing a tree. All right, and then so this is a grocery list just to let you know that at nativeplants.msu.edu, you can go and get a big long list of native plants. If you live on a lake shore, or if you have what we call riparian property, that means part of your land is shoreline from a lake, a pond, or a stream, then you want to go to MichiganShorelinePartnerships.org. That's MichiganShorelinePartnership.org, or you can just go Michigan Shoreline Partnership, put that in your search engine, Michigan Shoreline Partnership, and they have a really great list of wetland plants, native plants to plant along the shoreline, as well as some great information about landscaping along shorelines as well. Because there are some other rules that apply when you live along the shoreline, because you also have that added responsibility to protect the water quality, right, on your property or the lake. And water quality with lakes directly affects the value of your property that we know. So the better quality of your lake, the more value your house has. Yeah. Is there a deer resistant anything? Deer will browse on everything. Some things more than others. So, for example, hostas. Not all hostas are native, but hostas are one that tend to be deer resistant. However, I have people who report that deer will eat their hosta as well. So it just depends on how much local food is available for the deer. If there's more local food for the deer, they're not likely to eat your garden plants. If there's less local food for the deer, they're likely to eat your garden plants. They'll eat your lilies. Yeah, and deer are browsers, so they'll wander through your pumpkin patch and take a bite here and a nibble there and a bite here and a nibble there, and they'll damage 6 or 7 pumpkins or whatever, squash or whatever they're eating. I have squirrels, and they will eat the blossoms before a fruit can even form. So I'm challenged. Hey, I have woods on 3 sides of me at the end of a cul-de-sac. So whatever they want to eat in my yard, I'm helpless to do anything about it anymore. So I just give up and just plant things, and what survives, survives, and what doesn't. End of story. Give it a blessing. Pollinator-friendly shrubs. So here's some azaleas, rhododendrons. Rabbits like to eat those. Potentillas. New Jersey tea tends to like a wetter ground. Spirea will grow anywhere. And wild type roses are good pollinator-friendly shrubs. There are many others, but any shrub with a flower will support pollinators, right? And don't forget, of course, fruit shrubs. Your berries also support the pollinators. So if you wanted to, don't let it go to brambles, but if you wanted to let put in some raspberries or blueberries. I have a strawberry patch. I have a strawberry patch in my front garden, and I use them as the living strawberries are actually a mulch for my lily garden. So I planted a bunch of lily bulbs, and then I planted a bunch of strawberries around my lily bulbs. I get in this small, I don't know, probably 10 by 10 triangle type patch. I get 8 quarts of berries every year out of it. So that's enough for me and my husband. It's a lot. That's 16 pints. So you can do that. I have blueberries in the back. The deer never let the blossoms get past blossom. It blooms and then the deer eat it. So, but they're there, they grow. And I suppose if I'm supporting, and you need to check your soil, right? I talked about the fact that I have a really acidic soil, and I've even added lime a couple of times to it. It's not changing anything. But I don't want to add so much lime that I'm destroying the soil structure as well. So I've decided to stop adding lime and just let it be what it's going to be. But you may need to. Soil tests are available through MSU now. Again, they are $26 a piece. And I recommend, if you're going to do a garden separate from a lawn, you do 2 soil tests, because you'll get 2 specific kinds of answers. You can't treat your garden like your lawn. You want to soil test them separately. Okay. And then, so support bees, trees. Has anybody here read the Douglas Tallamy's book, Bringing Nature Home? So his biggest advocate is trees, and trees are huge. They have many, many flowers, and they will pollinate they will support both the pollinators and support native larvae, the caterpillars and such that we need to fulfill the food chain that support birds and other insect animals that feed on insects. So they support a huge number of different insects. These are all good. They all bloom. I'm allergic to pretty much every one of them, which is why I'm like I am today. Yeah, it's a thing. And again, it's just a grocery list because there's hundreds of trees, right? And so they're important. So do what you can where you can. They're important for our food ecosystems. They are extremely diverse. Some are in decline and could use our help. And with combined effort, with all of us working together, we can make a difference. One of us by ourselves alone, we think, how can I make a difference? We can't too much, a little bit, right? But if we all try, eventually we will make a difference. And all those small islands we call our yards. And then so start small. I have this as an example. I bought this 10 years ago before I realized it was really not that useful. It needs to be wider. So some small wasps do use it. It's 10 years old and you can see it's not heavily used. It is made out of bamboo, and bamboo makes great houses for solitary bees. Most all of our native bees are what we call solitary bees, right? The honeybee is a colony bee. And all the other bees are solitary bees. They don't live in colonies. And so they put their little nest in there, they'll put their egg, they'll put their pollen ball, and they'll put their egg in there, and they'll put a little mud wall or a grass wall. Sometimes it's a bug in there. And they will do another one and another one and another one. And Mother Nature's really cool because the last one in, the first one in is the last one to hatch. It's like in nose. So the one on the outside hatches first, even though it was the latest egg to be laid. Insects are really cool. Anyway, this is the right width. I borrowed this from my 4-H educator. She makes these. She makes these with kids. These are a bunch of cardboard straws. They're all different sizes. I will pass these around. And they would put a strap on this and hang it from a tree. I would recommend doing a bigger bundle. And you can use bamboo. You can buy a bunch of bamboo and cut them up in between the knuckles, and you'll have that hollow stem. Or use hollow stems. Or if you are going to use a cardboard straw, you can buy them. You would definitely want to, and I will show this here so you guys can see. Is it coming in good? Okay. You want to get different sizes for the different bees. They do need to be longer. And I'll pass this around so you can get it. It doesn't attract as many bees as it should because it's not deep enough. Yeah, it's only 4 inches wide and it really needs to be about 8 inches wide. It needs to be double this. And you can make, as you can see on that one, on the center picture, you can see where they have the bundle of sticks. They have 2 bundles of sticks, and it's much, much wider, much deeper. And that's their preference. And so, and it works. It really does. They really do work. They will come to them. Build them and they will come. You can take them down and put fresh ones up every year or just leave them. Sometimes a different one will come in next year and use the same cells. So I don't do anything. I just leave that there and I let the insects figure it out. What did we do with snag trees year after year? Nothing. The insects will figure it out. Yeah, they do. So, and then of course, provide water. You can support pollinators with water in the hot summer months when we have August droughts. You can see that bucket. I don't recommend the bucket. The bucket is a no. That's only up there to show you that they will come to any water. They'll come to pools. And the thing is see how many ones are floating in there? So it's better to do a bunch of rocks or marbles in a shallow pan and give them something to hang on to. Here's different kinds of nesting sites. There's, of course, your ground bees on the left. If you look on the left, there's your ground bee holes. And I do a talk about moles and lawn holes, other holes, because we often have unknown holes in our yard. What are those? It could have been a nesting bee that just crawled out, or a beetle, or whatever was hiding under the ground for the winter. And they will leave holes, right? And here's one, here's another one, and that's in a mud slope near a pond. There's your snag tree up close. And that's that snag tree right there. That's in my backyard. That's my snag tree. So, and then here's another, so mice holes, mice and moles and any animal that creates an underground nest or hole, bumblebees will use to overwinter in. So they do, if the mouse is actively living there, they risk being eaten by the mouse. But sometimes the mouse passes them right over. If it's buried under their nest, they don't even realize it's there. Because mice build caches of food in various places, and they'll go visit their caches of food as opposed to looking under their own nest. So they've got it figured out. So you can clean. So if you do have a bunch of blocks, it's perfectly okay to scrape the mud out and clean them out and make it ready for spring. So you can do that. Come back to the same one again. Like a birdhouse, you prep them right. And so you can support policy. What can you do, right? Back to that question, what can you do? You could support policy, contact your representatives, let them know you care, and what are they doing about it? Clearly, the Rotary Club is doing something about it because they sponsored you all here today. City council, township level, suggest what trees and plants. If you go to city council meetings or county board meetings or whatever, maybe say, okay, I know you cut down trees along the roadside, but are you replacing them with what? Just grass or pollinator plants? Because we have miles and miles and miles of roadside that don't produce flowers that could, and they could be supporting our bee populations, our pollinator populations. So, and then there's just some other recommendations that the pollinator champion folks decided needed to be in the slide. You don't have to do all of these. And definitely the number one on the list really should be pay attention to pesticides you use and use them sparingly and use them when needed and use them on your target. And then, so for more information, you can go to the pollinators.msu.edu, which I started this talk out with, right? And then you can take the Pollinator Champions course, of course, if you want to. It's also at that same website. Just muck around in there. You can't break anything. And then there's an app you can get. I mean, if you really want to go tech, you can get apps for your phone and be smart and all of that. And then we have time to talk about. So let me go back to the question we asked at the beginning. Did I answer your question? His question for those of you on Zoom he's curious to know if we have any local farmers that are practicing pollinator support. And I can't answer to specific farmers, but I do know that we do have programs that encourage farmers to put native plantings along their crop rows. And we also have some new programs that are focusing on managing their agriculture practices through climate change, which will also involve some of those more intensive conservation practices. So she had a question about yellow jackets and wasps, about being beneficial insects and eating the eating caterpillars. They also eat spiders. There are some that are specific to spiders as well. And there's one that's specific to cicadas, the giant cicada killer. All very cool. They're all beneficial. And yes, many of our wasps are also pollinators because they get nectar from the flowers. When they first hatch out, they need to feed, they need energy, they need food right away, and they immediately go to flowers to get nectar. And so in that role, then they're also acting as a pollinator.
Yes, and I want to thank Beth. Thank you very much. That was very awesome.